Welcome to IPD's 25th anniversary. We're so thrilled to thank you. We're so thrilled to have you all here and see so many familiar faces. We are going to give the floor to our founder and co-president, Professor Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, thank you all for coming. And some of you coming from a very long way. I thought I'd just to start things, not all of you may be familiar with the history and founding of IPD, so I thought I'd spend just a few minutes on that, and then a few minutes on acknowledgments, and then get the show going. Beginning of 1997, Jim Wolfson who was then president of the World Bank, asked me to come to become the chief economist, senior vice president of the World Bank. And I was at the point chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and President Clinton asked me to stay on, but couldn't, unfortunately. He got elected. He lost the Senate and the House. And so it was clear it was going to be a split administration, which meant that almost surely very little will go on. Some things did go on in the White House, but not in terms of progress, in terms of economic policy. So I had a feeling that it would be much more interesting to go to the World Bank. Those of you who've been in White House kind of those kinds of things know you spend a lot of time fighting to win a battle over your colleagues, and then after you win, you have to fight to win it in Congress, and you lose. So you make a lot of enemies and with your friends, and you don't make any friends with your enemies. So it didn't seem to me a good way of spending the next 4 years of my life. So, and I'd always been very interested in development, and partly because I was a child of that particular generation. Very different, I think, from today. When we were in graduate school in the mid-'60s, everybody was interested in development. It was, at least among my friends, it was really the key issue. How could a world be where there are these gaps in standards of living, $150 per capita income in large fractions of the world, and obviously much higher standards of living in the rest of the world. Bob Solow had written a paper about why there was supposed to be convergence, and obviously it wasn't happening. And so there was clearly a lot going on, and there were people that taught us at MIT, like Chakravarty, that were doing planning models. So it was really being in development was sort of what really developed what economics was about. And my first trip to a developing economy was in 1967 when I was 24 years old, just having finished my PhD a year earlier. I went on a global trip, and I went to China, where they still had rickshaws carried in by people. Now I find it so amusing that bicycle rickshaws are back in New York, but then seeing a rickshaw was a really, we've seen it in movies of the 19th century, but to go there and see them really being used was really quite striking. Went to Thailand, and then of course India was so colorful and very different, and Nepal, which is currently having some political problems once again. So I had really been very stimulated by those physics. Then I spent 69 to 71, a lot of that time, with the Rockefeller Foundation in Nairobi, and that inspired a number of my theoretical papers, just like George Akerlof's visit to India in 1965 inspired his paper on the theory of lemons. And so, rather than, it was among our cohort, rather than the knowledge flow going from developed to developing, we were studying developing, learning more about developed countries. And then my other big experience was working with Meredith here on the East Asia Miracle Project, which was sort of a hint of the issues that I would get involved next at the World Bank. The Japanese government had said that Japan thought it had been very successful in development, and it had been in the decades after World War II, and to some extent between 1905 and World War II. And what they said is, we didn't follow the Washington Consensus model, and you told the World Bank, you're propagating a theory of development that doesn't describe the most successful countries, those of East Asia. And so Japan said, we'll finance a study of what makes for successful development. The World Bank was not very interested in this idea. And I don't know how it eventually came about, but it was, this was before I got there, an enormous fight to get the World Bank to accept Japan's money to study what had made Japan and East Asia successful. But someone won that debate, and in some sense, Marilou and I and the other people who were on that team won, and we produced this book called The East Asia Miracle. Maybe as a footnote, I won't say what is published is a censored version of what we wrote, but it's a version that is a little toned down from what we wrote. That we were, I would say, maybe more critical of some aspects of the Washington Consensus, more supportive. For instance, we debated among ourselves the role, for instance, of industrial policy. We did agree that promoting equality was a very important ingredient in the success of East Asia. So there were some things that we agreed among ourselves and that got reflected, and some things where there was disagreement and that got a little bit toned down, but not eliminated. So so after I got the invitation to go to the World Bank, really for me very exciting. I found things a little bit different, but maybe not that different from what had happened when I was in the Clinton administration, because we had a lot of really good and interesting debates about issues like trade policy and capital market liberalization, Social Security, old age reform. But the nature of those debates at the World Bank were somewhat different. And let me just very briefly describe some of the, I was a little bit provocative, I guess, when I was in the Clinton administration. I said, the center, that one of our first things was international trade policy, economic policy. And I put forward the radical hypothesis that the center of our trade policy, international economic policy, should not be making the world safe for Goldman Sachs derivatives. That was not should not be the center of our economic agenda. And I have teased people in the Bush administration and the first Bush administration that had come before me and said that a central plank of their trade policy was making the world better for Toys R Us. And they made a big trade agreement where they insisted that Toys R Us and other American retailers open up in Japan. And I said, it was great that Japanese children were getting more Chinese toys at cheaper prices. I thought that was great for China, great for Japanese children, but I didn't see why that should be the center of American economic policy. I did understand that it enhanced Toys R Us profits. Toys R Us, as you know, went bankrupt. And so it was important for us to save, to enhance the profits to Toys R Us, but that should be the center of our economic policy. Again, any of you know how administrations work. I felt confident that Clinton would agree with me. But some of our friends in Treasury, you know who I may be talking about, knew that too. And so their effort went totally to make sure that Clinton never saw this view of what national economic strategy ought to be about. And they largely succeeded. So we never had in the administration that discussion of what should be U.S. national economic policy. But there were many elements of this. One of them, for instance, was the idea of capital market liberalization. And the question was theory, evidence, was it a good thing? And in particular, was it good, looking at it from the point of view not of global prosperity, but of U.S., was it something that we should voice to other countries? And Japan had a statement saying that they didn't think it was Korea, but the U.S. Treasury said it was very good for Goldman Sachs, and therefore it should be the center of our U.S.-Korea policy. And we did that, Korea, until it gave in, and then, as you know, we had a crisis in 1997. So, moving then from being in the administration to being in the World Bank, we went through many of the same debates, but the debates were as if only voices were from the U.S. Treasury. Those views about privatization of Social Security, capital market liberalization, sounded like I was just hearing the voices of U.S. Treasury. And so that maybe began my radicalization to be a little bit outspoken about what was going on. We had a lot of victories. And one more thing that I found very interesting was the way U.S. Treasury tried to wield power, both, just because it was wrong, but also by shutting down debate and discussion. So one issue where I'm only going to talk about the issues where I won, not where I lost. So one issue where I won is an issue that we're still engaged on in intellectual property rights. And we came out with a WDR, the flagship report of the World Bank on intellectual property rights. report was on knowledge, and a few words of knowledge was really important for development, separating developing countries from developed was a gap in knowledge, and that IPI was very important in that. And we said that we needed a more balanced IPI regime. So we wrote a section that was very carefully balanced, I thought, but sort of pushing it in one direction. U.S. Treasury said, no, you can't do that. The stronger the intellectual property rights, the better, and you have to put that in the report. And so they were going to stop that totally. So we got India to complain that we were unbalanced, that we had advocated too strong of intellectual property rights. And India got a lot of other countries to join in. And in the end, the U.S. government said, oh, we can't have this battle over this paragraph in this WDI. And we got U.S. Treasury to give it. Ravi Thakur, who was here, and was having every 10 years we do one on poverty. And we had done a wonderful report on voices of the poor and asked them what they cared about, and not just lack of income, but lack of voice, lack of security. And we made that, Ravi made that the center of his WDR. And U.S. Treasury, we won't say who, went ape and said, we're just supposed to talk about income, not these things called voice, security, and trying to get it all done. Fortunately, we had, maybe it's partly anticipating this, put everything on the web, and we've done lots of dialogues in Africa and elsewhere. And so when the U.S. Treasury came in and insisted on a change of the WDR to the usual, there was an enormous pushback. And in the end, we won. But this lack of voice, lack of transparency happened over and over again. When this seems strange, but when the Russians wanted to know what to do in response to the ruble crisis, that was before it happened, the U.S. Treasury said, instructed Jim Wilkerson, my boss. I never, as an academic, got accustomed to the idea that there's hierarchy. And he never got accustomed to the idea that I hadn't gotten accustomed to hierarchy. So we had a little bit of a problem. But he told me I couldn't go. He had to elevate to the Secretary of Treasury, actually telling Wilkinson that to instruct me not to go to Russia, even to talk to them. So the only thing that I could do to combat that was to get Yeltsin, who ranked higher than the U.S. Secretary of Treasury in the Goldin. And so I got a request, we organized a request from Yeltsin for me to go. And Treasury did not want to elevate that to have Clinton challenge Yeltsin. So I did go. They had they had a ruble crisis anyway. So it didn't. So I'm told 2 minutes. What I want to when I left the World Bank, let me maybe set a record straight, and some of the things I was fired, but that was not quite true. And this is an ambiguity that is always the case. The limit of World ambiguity. they gave conditions that made it impossible for me to stay. Rather than being fired, they said, and this was again from the U.S. Treasury. They said, we love your job, we love what you're doing at the World Bank. You can stay on the condition that you don't talk. or that I didn't openly be criticized in IMF. My view is, I'm not criticizing IMF if they say, well, if they are advocating the wrong policies. My job as an international civil servant, which I took my role as when I went to the World Bank, I made it going there as an international civil servant, working not as an American, but working for the international community. So that was what I did. And so I had needs. So, but I thought when I left, the developing countries needed more voice. They needed advice. In the 50 years, there have been enormous advances in capital in the developing countries. But part of the problem is the advances in capital have been people trained in economics in the United States. And so they got trained in large measure in places like University of Chicago, very influential, particularly Latin America. It reminded me of what happened when I wanted to go when I got Fulbright to Cambridge, and they had discussion with the faculty at Cambridge how exactly I enter into Cambridge. And Joe Robinson, I don't remember, great economist, said that I had to start as a first-year undergraduate. I had done all my coursework at MIT for a PhD. I had to start as a first-year undergraduate because I had to be deprogrammed. And deprogramming was worse than starting from scratch. So if she could, she would have had to start below a freshman, but a first year, but they didn't have that. So I had to start as a first year. There were other people like Chamberlain and Frank Hamuarki, eventually Trump. And so the condition was that she was my supervisor when I went to Cambridge. So we had a lot of heated interactions. Over the years, IPD has had a very multi-pronged strategy. At the core of it is research. I'm an academic and feel very strongly that policy has to be based on intellectual foundation theory, particularly that's what I do, empirical. But also that there had to be engagement where people's voice, developing countries' voices. And so in the research, many of you may know, we've had now 50 volumes of books on various topics, which is, I think, probably one of the largest collections of books on development. Engagement, particularly in the early years, where many people who helped organize this come to a think in a minute. We had dialogues in countries, and these were very, very exciting. We'd be invited to discuss with the Moldova parliament, leaders in a large way, Nigeria, in the Balkans, a lot of various Sri Lanka, various policy issues that were key, and we could do it from a perspective that gave them a voice, an alternative to the Washington consensus ideas. And finally, we were very committed to dissemination. Believing in democracy, you need to have popular support for your ideas. And we need to disseminate ideas to academics so they can teach students not the wrong ideas, but the right ideas. And that's where we started our journal. But also, we had a journalism program that tried to train journalists. We've had laying out the intellectual foundation, we have notable successes and half successes. Our partnerships have been critical. This is a reflection of, I'd say, a general theorem. Any issue that's very important shouldn't be decided by one person. If it's not important, you can have one person decide, but if it's important, you need to engage a mass in one way or another. And that's where I think so many partnerships make so many of you here have been so important that working together, I think we've been able to make progress on a number of issues. One example, many of you may know the virulent attack, for instance, by Ken Rogoff, who doesn't seem to be here, against me when suggested I must be smoking something when I said capital market liberalization was not necessarily a good thing. So one of our little victories was in 2011, the IMF said capital market liberalization wasn't such a good thing, and started allowing countries to do programs to have capital management, capital restrictions. And there's a strong theory behind that, and we helped develop that theory. Another example, talked for a very long time about the importance of inequality. And I'm under Strauss-Kahn, put that very much in the center of their agenda. And then one, I'd say little victory, but actually it's a big victory, it was with Barr getting the IMF to lower the surcharges. And this illustrates, you can say it's a little thing or a big thing, but it was several billion dollars, like $3-4 billion every year for developing countries. And for those countries, that's a lot of money. So while it was a little perturbation in our global economic system, it was a perturbation that actually made a difference for the lives of a lot of people. One of the issues that we fought with and had a lot of partners with, like FEPS, is on the debate on austerity and FES as well. These were debates that we had in Europe, and I hope some of our voice helped move dealing with the euro crisis as well. On intellectual property, it's something like I view it as a half success. We got Biden to support we were among those who got Biden to support the waiver of the COVID-19 vaccine. We failed to get any support of the waiver on other intellectual property rights. But we did succeed working with Matthew, to get in the G20 a commitment to have production of pandemic products in developing countries, which means that we will be better prepared for the next pandemic. So the point is, these are long-term battles. The ideas get put forward now, and maybe 30 years later, we'll actually have success, but it takes a long time. Those of us who worked on industrial policy, where 30 years ago it was a bad word, somebody was telling me that there was a deep state at the World Bank that, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say this. Okay, that somebody told me that there was a deep state of the World Bank that said industrial policy was a naughty word, even though the World Bank was doing industrial policy all the time. So now, 30 years later, industrial policy is on the public agenda, not always being done well, as Trump tries to use trade policy to reindustrialize the United States, a failure, but still. So I hope this conference is not just a review of our successes, but really focused on the questions how we as a community can be more effective. Moment of rethinking. We won the battle, I think, against neoliberalism, but then what? And what is following neoliberalism could be worse than neoliberalism. We warned that it could get worse, and it has. Now there's two battles against neoliberalism, which is like zombie, dead, but it's still walking among us, and a battle against nationalism and populism of the worst form. So the past 25 years has been wonderful. It's creating the community, part of a wider community. We've had a wonderful group of people working with us, young people, who we feel very proud that we've helped set them on their life journey. And so happy that so many of them are backing. Thank them once again for what they've done to make all this possible. I was going to spend a few minutes on acknowledgments, but my time is up. So I guess we'll do that maybe at dinner and talk about acknowledge. But the lack of acknowledgement now should not be viewed as a lack of acknowledging all of what you've done, but just because we want to move on in time, and I'll spend 5 minutes tonight, this evening, at the dinner talking about that. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Cassidy of The New Yorker. I'm very glad to be here for this august occasion, and also like to just start by paying a quick tribute to Joe, who I've known on and off for many years. First came across him when I was a student, and his theoretical work. I remember particularly his proof in, I think, maybe 50 lines or so, that financial markets couldn't possibly be informationally efficient, which at the time was sort of revolutionary thought. Then I again came across him when he was in the Clinton White House in his career as a public official, and then obviously since then I've been following his third career as a public intellectual and a policy advisor through this institution, but also others. Anywhere you go around the world, you tend to find that Joe has been there just before you arrived. So I just as I said, I'd like to pay tribute to him, and I think I don't want to be too cloying, but he is in, I think, the sort of grand tradition of what I'd call political economists, going back through, to the start of the subject, through Keynes and Marshall, and all the way back to Adam Smith, really, who had a strong basis in theory. Joe's a brilliant theoretician, nobody could argue with that, but also a understanding that economics really only exists for its public purpose, and that's what it's really all about. So thanks very much for everything over the years, Joe. Okay, now on to the moment here. We've gathered some very distinguished people to discuss basically the state of the world, which, as we all know, is not great. The distinguished panel here, and I could introduce them one by one, but you forget, so I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves when they first make their own presentations, because I know when I'm in an audience I always forget who the people are by the time they speak. So please introduce yourself when you speak. But the task we have here is explaining how we got here, and where we go, what's your prognosis, and where we go from here. Now, having spent the last 5 years writing a history book on the same subject, I have a little skepticism of whether we'll be able to resolve everything in an hour or so, but we'll give it our best shot. Perhaps I could just start out by asking you, I mean, going back to my book, I mean, what the current constellation reminds me of more than anything else is the 1930s. So I think it's sort of only comparable period of crisis in sort of global economy and in global economic thinking since then. And I didn't really know much about Polanyi before I wrote my book, but I studied his stuff. And he wrote a paper in 1935 or so saying basically capitalism's finished, capitalist democracy is finished. The only solutions are fascism or socialism. The centre cannot hold. So I think that was sort of 10 out of 10 on the crisis, on the global crisis. So I just ask our panel to maybe start their comments by, after they've introduced themselves, maybe just for fun, on a scale of 1 to 10, telling us how they rate the current crisis, and then go on to give their prognosis. And if we could do maybe 5 minutes each or 6 minutes each, that would give us a bit of time for discussion among us, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience. Anyway, so let's go along the line, start with Jayati. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think everyone probably shares what a great privilege and honor it is to be part of the IPD celebrations. It's IPD and Joe have just been a beacon in our dark times, right, in so many different ways. And I think Joe mentioned many of the reasons, and the fact that, yes, you've not only attracted young people, but you've kept them and you're getting more. I mean, it's just amazing. And I'm really very, very happy to be here today in these dark times. I also just want to pay a special tribute to Joe. I mean, of course, we all know about his brilliance and his wisdom and his energy and his commitment, but I just want to focus on the energy. I mean, honestly, Joe, really, I think I do maybe 1/10 of what he does, and I feel exhausted, and I don't know how he does it. Every time he's arranging meetings on, in between flights, he's on a road journey from Linz to Graz, and he will do a meeting, and he will be deeply committed, and he'll have read everything, and he will be able to discuss it, in a very sort of significant way. So I'm just continuously amazed, actually. But thank goodness you're there, and please keep doing it. It's just very, very important for all of us. So thank you. So yeah, we were sent a list of very provocative questions and very tough questions about the state of the world and all of that. And I think among them was things like, what will follow neoliberalism now that Trump is not a neoliberal, and what was neoliberalism actually trying to achieve rather than, just the sort of declared intentions. And I think I want to begin with that. I think, neoliberalism was never about deregulation. Maybe there was a question about did progressives get it wrong. I think that's what we got wrong. It was about regulating in the interests of large capital. Large global capital, but essentially large capital. So it's really about fixing the laws and regulations in a way that would enhance and further the interests of large capital. And of course, associated with that, all the other stuff, it was presented as deregulation or liberalization, but wasn't really about that. Because if you looked at the nitty-gritty, it was always favoring certain interests, and those happened to be the already stronger interests. If you look at it in that larger perspective, then of course neoliberalism is not dead. It's very much alive. And I should also mention that even the deregulatory part is very much alive in the developing world. And me too, I'm also a believer that maybe we can think of BRICS and etc. But let's face it, the BRICS governments mostly are still neoliberal as well. Some openly so, some less openly, but nonetheless. So it's not dead, unfortunately. It's maybe, Joe, you're right, that there's a kind of zombie form of it. I remember the German philosopher Wolfgang Steck saying that capitalism is also dead. It's just that there's nobody to shift the dead body out of the way. So it's kind of hanging over us like this shroud, okay? So in that world, what is it that, what is it that's going on right now? First, very quickly. So I would say that there are really two things. First of all, there's a lot of talk about Stockholm Syndrome when you're talking about the Trump's trade deals, and how the allies are also coming and then coming up with these really strained, happy faces saying, we've got this wonderful trade deal with the US, where they've given up everything in return for a worse situation than before. But actually, Stockholm Syndrome has existed with governments vis-à-vis large capital now for decades. We've all had Stockholm Syndrome in terms, our governments have had it, in terms of saying, yes, we have to keep giving more concessions to large capital, because then we will get a little bit of trickle down or we will get something in return. Which, in other words, means that our governments have been deeply imbued with that fundamental neoliberal idea. And this is evident still today, and it's very, very strong in the international financial institutions, I regret to say, including the World Bank that Joe so valiantly tried to change. So we still have all the blended finance, forgive my sake, so crap, even though it's very clear it doesn't work. And we still have governments and multilateral institutions doing everything possible to try and persuade and incentivize private capital to enter into, let's say, climate alleviation or various other things, at great cost to public exchequers and to taxpayers, and with very, very little benefit. We still have an unspoken acceptance that you can't really do anything serious about capital controls. And you can't do anything serious about regulating domestic capital, including finance. We still have a whole range of things so that it's not, the trade deals themselves are all about opening up markets in the developing world, or frankly, even in Europe. The kinds of concessions the European Union has made is also are crazy as well. So we haven't got over that whole notion that it is going to be a trickle down and that the only way to grow for developing countries is export-led growth, because that's why you're worried about the tariffs. If you were thinking about the things, you would not be so worried about tariffs. So what do we do now? I think we have to move that further step away from it. So I would say we have to actually recognize exactly the kinds of things Joe was talking about, that you really have to think about an economy that is based on very, very completely different parameters. And that really means not focusing on large capital as the means to economic expansion, on profitability as the essential criteria that has to be fostered. And of course, then all the other things follow, right? Employment, social conditions, protection, et cetera, The focus on inequality is important for that perspective, for both pre-distribution and redistribution perspectives. Essentially, I think really we have to get rid, in most of the developing world, of the export-led growth paradigm. I think Trump has done us all a favor by kind of forcing us out of it, kicking and screaming, but still has actually done us a favor in that respect. But we also have to get rid of the growth per se as the means to an end. And Joe has done so much work himself. Many people in this room have done on measures beyond GDP, but nonetheless that remains the basic thing, because that's the story of capitalism, right? Growth at all costs. So I think we have to move beyond those. And just to end on I don't know whether you call it hopeful or whatever, note, it's true that at the moment politics seems very weak and geopolitics seems very weak. But changes often come when we don't expect them. And I do believe, if you look at South Asia today, nobody expected Sri Lanka to get the kind of election result of it. Nobody expected the student movement in Bangladesh to actually manage to overthrow its government. Last week, we had a young people's movement in Nepal that has overthrown the government. Yes, there's chaos. Yes, there's instability. But I think many in the subcontinent would argue it is a better instability than the stability of the graveyard that you got in the earlier context. So yeah, on that note, let me stop.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Next, Glenn, would you like? Glenn, I'm sure you all know him. Probably doesn't need any introduction from Columbia here.
I'm Glenn Hubbard, a faculty member in Columbia Economics Department in the Business School. I'd like to join the kudos to you, Joe, for the 25 years of IPD. Joe is my teacher, my colleague, a friend. I will say a little bit about Donald Trump in my remarks, but one thing Donald Trump did do is bring Joe and me somewhat closer together in our overlap of policy ideas and interests. And for that, I'm grateful, because I always enjoy my conversations with Joe. Having said that about the president, none of this discussion, I think, about neoliberalism and alternatives really begins with him. I think that both neoliberalism and some of the progressive challenges to it essentially lost the thread with the public. President Trump, like many successful politicians, saw that and rode the wave clearly before him. Why was that? I think that as an economist, a room full of people who have economic interests or who are economists, we generally focus on topics like growth and progress, But of course, all contemporary models of growth and progress involve disruption at the same time. And it's that disruption that really has brought the political economy lens to neoliberalism and to the progressive critique. Politics only has three responses to disruption. One is to do nothing, to hope it goes away. I'll come back to that in some of the neoliberal critique. Another is to build walls against it and persuade the public I can make it go away. Or a third is to build a bridge to something else. Those are the only three choices. We've done more of the first and the second than we have the third. Now, what were those big changes? Mainly technological advance, secondarily to economists, or primarily to politicians, globalization. Those are really the forces I'm talking about. What did neoliberals get wrong? We were asked to consider that in the neoliberal agenda. What did it truly intend? I was really glad that John mentioned Polanyi, because I plan to address him. In 1944, I'm sure there were many books published, but two noteworthy to me. One was Hayek's Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom was actually serialized in Reader's Digest because DeWitt Wallace enjoyed the book. In 1944, Polanyi published a magisterial book called The Great Transformation, which was not serialized in Reader's Digest for a number of reasons. But I think the essence of the neoliberal problem was the emphasis on, using my words, a rules first, not a people first system. Polanyi's criticism of the gold standards strictures could also be applied to neoliberalism's rules first, not people first. In the Great Transformation, Polanyi looked at what I would call a kind of connective tissue in an economy that's disruption. That we have familiar property rights, but there may be other kinds of property rights that neoliberals don't see. And I think any criticism of neoliberalism really needs to focus on Polanyi's very rich description of that tissue. What I think neoliberals got wrong was the idea that an unfettered economy was the best way to this rules first, not people first solution, because it really left many in the body politic, many regions of countries inadequately prepared for the structural disruption that they would see. What was intended, and you put it, was really growth and innovation. But to my mind, thinking more about classical liberalism as opposed to neoliberalism, there's more of an overarching goal of being a participant in society. When I think of classical liberalism, I think of Smith, but not just the Smith of the Wealth of Nations. I'm thinking of Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, that basically a successful society is one that maximizes participation. And I think that element was missing. What did progressives get wrong in that debate? I said I think they lost the thread too. The idea that wishing away disruption, of course, also means wishing away growth and participation. And if you really want to have a participation society, you have to focus on reconnection, you have to focus on preparation, not protectionism, not the goal, and not a hydra-headed industrial policy. Joe spoke more friendly of industrial policy than I might, but clearly attaching child care regulation to the CHIPS Act doesn't strike me as an economic industrial policy. What could progressive capitalism look like? I think it has to center on preparation and reconnection. Let me be specific. In the US, we once did big things about preparation. Think about the land-grant college movement. The land-grant colleges were intended to accommodate a structural shift from agriculture to manufacturing. They democratized education in that day, not what we would call true democratization today, but better than the elite higher ed that had come before it. After the Second World War, the GI Bill was similarly a big idea to accommodate millions of American soldiers who'd be coming home to a structurally changed economy. We're not thinking big enough. What could that be today? Austin Goolsbee and I had argued some years ago it could be a large block grant to community colleges, which are the foot soldiers in the educational system of structural change, not Columbia or Harvard or places like that. It could be a rethinking of place-based aid, which economists generally were skeptical of, but recent very good work suggests there are ways to target place-based aid. And a big emphasis, in contrast to what we're now seeing in Washington, on both basic and applied research. Basic research for an obvious reason, and its high social returns, but applied research because applied research centers could be located around the country, much as the land-grant colleges stimulated manufacturing extension services and agricultural extension services at the time they were successful. In reconnection, I would just suggest that we need to rethink social insurance. Most of the contemporary social insurance problems we have aren't that contemporary. They came from the 1930s era. They are about temporary changes in aggregate demand, more than thinking programs like unemployment insurance, than they are thinking about structural changes. What could you do there? A number of ideas, some from the right, some from the left, ranging from personal reemployment accounts on the right to wage insurance for older workers on the left, and even ideas that economists generally been skeptical of, but I think merit at least a conversation about pre-distribution as well as redistribution. What happens if we get all this wrong? Status. I mean, that's what I'm really worried about on the right and the left. We all have a dog in this fight to try to initiate these ideas and have a conversation. Otherwise, I do fear a status into play.
Okay, thank you very much for those remarks. Moving along the panel, David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Great, thanks very much. I'm David Kennedy. I teach, among other things, law development at Harvard Law School, where I've been doing that for quite a long time. Like Joe, I got involved in development in the 70s, in my PhD, when I thought it was a thing that was going to really be at the center of everything. But I want to say, over the years of teaching about development in a legal context, the existence of IPD, the existence of Joe Stiglitz, and the work that you've done collaborating with me and with so many others has been really important. So to be able to put a good foot out into the economic world and understand there were alternative voices, and to see how diverse those alternative voices were has made a huge difference, because we've had, within the legal field, our own neoliberalism that has been very dominant in lots of different ways. And so thank you, Joe, for your friendship and for your support over all these years. We were asked what neoliberals got wrong, what progressives got wrong, and what to do next. And I want to focus on law in that. And I just made a simple list. None of these things will be unfamiliar, but just to put it all in one place. So if we think of neoliberalism as a set of policies, what were the misreadings of what law was that one could now retrospectively, or even in current moments, think are there? So first, just most basically, mistaking what law could and couldn't do, and what kinds of things law could bring into being as a social event, property rights being the most classic case of imagining credit emergence when you have property rights rather than there being an institutional dimension. Mistaking the interplay of regulation with economic activity, or at least saying they were mistaking that interplay in some way. So misunderstanding the way in which economic activity had grown up with regulation, rather than seeing it always as something added on afterwards. Third, I'd say misreading weak developing country state capacity as an argument for weakening the state further, rather than strengthening it, and not understanding the internal significance of a series of institutional developments within the post-colonial state that would have been much more important than the policies specific that were being proposed. I'd say overreading what corruption was, how damaging it always was, rather than how useful it sometimes could be in a political economy sense. But most importantly, misunderstanding what would happen if you had an aggressive anti-corruption effort, either at the national or at the international level, added on top of weak LDC state capacity, and how that could create really harmful effects in all kinds of circumstances. I think that overcommitment to private settlement and arbitration in contexts where that's very likely to favor some parties massively over others. But that might be particularly true in the developing context. There's a long list. Overcommitment to transparency without attention to transparency for whom. So the idea that transparency for global capital markets and global investors may make things less transparent for people in a domestic situation. And that was in part, I think, went along with either ignorance of or hostility to informal legal arrangements, or the way in which legal arrangements are settled in a variety of locally understood practices in all kinds of different places. So a mistaking of the depth with which law is embedded in other kinds of social arrangements. A few more. I think at the ideological level, I would put on the list an overcommitment to the separation of public and private and their distinction within law. Rent seeking is a classic case. The idea that you're rent seeking if you use a license you're granted by the state in some particular way, and looking for a license is rent seeking. But if you have property rented by the state, what you're doing is using your property in some productive way. So in that sense, even process and innovation rents have legal foundations and could be understood in some way to be an aspect not only of rent seeking, but of what is necessary for different kinds of growth. And I guess maybe the largest thing is an overcommitment to the idea that there's a market prior to law. That something happens in economic life and to which law is then added or which law must then defend. And that market has its own efficiency and its own logic without understanding how many of its elements, credit, money, who can act, what they can do, property, and so on and so forth, start out as legal arrangements that might be put together in a variety of different ways and don't have one single solution. That's a long list, right? I mean, I think I'd also put there, if we go back to the informal market idea, a misunderstanding of the significance of local economies and persistent dualisms, imagining there's a single legal system in a developing country or even in our own country here, misunderstanding the diversity internally of the expectations and social arrangements which we could imagine to be law. Well, the list of what progressives got wrong is much shorter because it's all the same things actually. So there was, in some way, I think that the overinvestment in the defense of an international liberal order for trade, a misreading of the foreign legal tools that were used in all the way back to the Japan report that Joe spoke of earlier, an overinvestment in regulation, inattention to the background norms and informal norms that construct the market and so forth, has all been part also of the limitations of progressive ideas about the relationship of law to development in some way. So what to do? Not to do that. There's a new kind of movement in the legal field that goes under the age-old slogan, political economy and law, and it's developed all kinds of useful recent scholarship. What are they proposing as a progressive agenda inside law? So I guess, first of all, getting rid of economistic thinking. It would be the first thing to do, which has been so significant and had a very specific need. It hasn't been institutionalist economic thinking that has been present within the legal field, but something very neoliberal in its orientation. But shifting the goal of legal design from questions of neutrality or efficiency to questions of power and hierarchy and inequality, thinking about struggle among groups rather than the setting up of level playing fields for individual actors within an economy. Attention to system dynamics, so Gunnar Myrdal style leading and lagging sectors, and more importantly, the legal arrangements that speed or retard the flows between those regions in ways, and how that happens and how they might be reconstructed. So new targets and places for potential intervention might be discovered by attention to those kinds of internal dynamics.
Coming up on 10 minutes, David.
I have one more thing to say, which is reopening. Progressives should learn more about property, should get into the background norms that structure the economy, the financial norms and so forth, and not think only about regulation that a benign government, if we ever had one, might be able to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very interesting contribution. Maria?
Great pleasure to address all of you. And I'm bringing here the voice of the European Union. This is based on my own experience as full professor of economics. But then I went to a political career, I made a tour of European institutions. And that's why now I took the role of chairing the foundation of the progressive family in Europe. But we, in fact, represent a much larger network of foundations, including Friedrich Schiller Foundation, which is there, Matthias. Always a pleasure to work together. And I'd like to start exactly by highlighting the importance of listening to Joe again. This is amazing to listen yourself, your own story, because we understand why you took a full sequence of decisions, big choices in your life, but enabling us to count on someone like you, a kind of guide to overcome the neoliberal paradigm. So, Joe, many, many thanks. And I'd like to underline particularly what happened to us in the European Union when we were involved in the Eurozone crisis, so the kind of climax of the neoliberal paradigm applied to European integration. And thanks to people like Joe, we could start pushing for an alternative, avoid the collapse of the Eurozone, the implosion of the European Union. This is a going story, so it's still to be a completed story. But in fact, changing macroeconomic approach regarding the austerity recipe, starting to speak about industrial policy, which was forbidden in the European Union, and building up what we call now European Pillar of Social Rights was a full sequence of our collaboration. So again, many thanks, but we'll go on working together for sure. And what I'd like to do now, in a few minutes, is to bring the current debates of the European Union to this important conference. By coincidence, 2 days ago, we are running the State of the Union speech and debate in the European Union. And we are still digesting the impact of a trade deal, European Union, United States, which is being perceived by many of us as a humiliating deal. I can tell you this. And I will tell the story, but probably not now, if I have the chance of a second intervention. So let me keep this carrot, because there is a very interesting story why we feel this humiliating. This is much more than a trade deal. But what I'd like to do now in a few minutes is to bring you a kind of very brief summary of how progressive Europeans look to the current world. So I'm bringing, to complement my panel colleagues, perspective of political economy, international political economy, mainly by starting by saying, what is your assessment of the global landscape? And look, of course, we know that we are in front of great powers game. We consider that we have a unfair world, very weak multilateral governance, a crisis of the multilateral system. But we are also having interesting debates on the changing nature of the American hegemony. What is happening to the hegemonic power of the United States? Is there a situation of decline? Is there an attempt at revival? Well, in any case, two scenarios are possible. Frankly, I think it's too early to answer to this question, but I'm just also inviting you to comment this. What is for sure for us is that the word isolationist is not the proper word to qualify the behavior of the current American agenda. Because what we see is that there is an active defense of American interests, but when other countries they start defending their own interests, we feel there is coercion. There is coercion. This is what we feel. And so we reach a point, I can tell you, that in the European Union, we are start feeling that we need to move to another way to act in the world, and certainly to overcome the neoliberal paradigm is becoming a matter of survival for the future of the European project. This is at least as how we feel as European progressive actors. And so let me just highlight 2 points, because of course I need to be short. It's what can be, let's say, an alternative to the neoliberal plan. If we start with trade, and the trade war triggered by the American side, what we feel is that there is a kind of paradox, because we feel that United States is going to a protectionist position regarding several sectors, particularly industrial sectors, because it lost normal competitive advantages, is no longer competitive in several, let's say, classical manufacturing sectors. But the paradox is that in other sectors, notably services, and particularly notably the digital, the American behavior is not protectionist, is mercantilist, is trying to promote its own model to conduct the digital transformation. This is what we feel from the European side. And so this brings me to the point I'd like to draw your attention for us as economists is the implication of the digital transformation for economic thinking. Because this is a transformation we cannot just grasp by using the classical tools of macroeconomic approach or microeconomic approach. We need to go to what we can call the meso approach. So the role of networks, the role of platforms, the way digital platforms are reorganizing completely supply and demand in those sectors, and the way global supply chains are being conducted by powerful digital tools. Unless we understand what is really happening in this dimension, economic reality, we will not be able really to overcome the neoliberal plan. And so the discussion we are having in Europe now is the following. And in fact, what I feel is that the European position also is finding some equivalence in many other countries across the world. We can ask to conduct this digital transformation. Well, this is certainly the most important transformation of our lives. This is not only about the power of digital tools, this is now the new wave launched by AI, which is a big difference, because this means that knowledge now can circulate and used independently for time and space, and we know that the knowledge of us is multiplied by the knowledge of the others. So it is a revolution in our lives. And so the question in terms of political economy is who controls the algorithm and who organizes the databases to train the algorithm? These are the big questions we should address. And what I see across the world is that there are many countries saying, well, we'd like to try other ways to make the best of this digital transformation, which are not necessarily the ways used by the leading powers who are, for the time being, United States and China. Perhaps there are other ways. And that's why in the European Union, we'd like to advocate for a more decentralized architecture, enabling countries to test other ways. Example, to start from citizens' needs in different sectors, in health, in education, in environment, in cities management, and to bring about new AI solutions. This is the kind of experimentation we would like to push for. We believe this can help to overcome the neoliberal paradigm. This is exactly a historical juncture where there is a kind of bifurcation. Either we use AI just to replace human agency, or use AI to empower people to complement human intelligence. And we believe that, again, we'd like to use this network of economies working to overcome the neoliberal paradigm to be part of a new challenge, is how to shape the digital transformation.
Thank you very much indeed.
I hope I won't need to tell you what happened.
Next time. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Kaushik, Basu.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here on this occasion. The world is going through a very, very difficult phase. To be with people with good minds and also good concerns is so very important today. So thank you very much for organizing and giving me the opportunity to talk. That we are among like-minded people, the very unusual reminder for me, I had a note here saying must talk about Karl Polanyi. And it's quite a coincidence that there have been 2 mentions already. And I thought I would be reminding people of that. So let me push Karl Polanyi aside and start by getting a bit into the topic, which was, we were given questions on neoliberalism. I have to say these were leading questions, but they were leading me in a direction in which I would like to be led. So I have no discomfort with that. To situate the problem, how have we come to where we are, the kind of view we have? Joe Stiglitz, I don't even know, Joe, if you will remember, it's your book, Free Fall. In the last chapter, it's a beautiful last chapter on, I forget the exact title, Toward a New Society. Joe Stiglitz mentions that some of the problem in the way we think today is an unintended consequence of mainstream economics. Both those words are important. Unintended is important because the way we've done mainstream economics, it's permeated into society, and we've got a view of the world that economics is separate from everything else, very anti-Polanyi, that it's not situated in many other values, and that has done great harm. One comment from history of economic thought which fascinates me, which shows the unintended consequence, Adam Smith, 1776, classic book, Wealth of Nations. From, if you go out into the streets, people who know a little bit of economics, if you ask them about Adam Smith, the only thing they know is the invisible hand. Individual selfishness is good enough to get social optimality. That's all they know. But that is an unintended consequence of Adam Smith is clear enough, because when the first edition of the book came out, where we do know Adam Smith worked on the index himself, invisible hand was not there in the index. So the part of the book that would go down as the central part, Adam Smith had not realized that that is going to be the core contribution of it. And that's the way the discipline has gone, sort of picking up on that and not realizing that economics has to be situated in the broader disciplines of other disciplines and also to other norms and values, which is actually in this last chapter, Free Fall, is all about the Great Recession and its immediate effect. But the last chapter I would recommend to everyone, which looks forward and talks about this, that the importance of situating it. I will also refer to one paper, probably Ken Arrow's least read paper. This is something that was published in Dissent in 1978. I think one of the reasons why it's also least read is the title. and Ken Arrow made the mistake of using the S word. The title is A Cautious Case for Socialism, which in the United States immediately means people won't read. What they don't realize is Ken Arrow was misusing the word socialism. He was not making a case for socialism, but he was making a case for a world which is very similar to what we are arguing over here. That you do need the profit motive, you do need enterprise, you do need markets, but you also need the government. You also need something that caps the levels of inequality that can arise in a market if there is absolutely no overseeing. And there is nothing about the way in which inequality happens. There is nothing about it which says that this is the laws of nature. Most of the way the market functions, it's because there are regulations, there are norms, trust that people talk about. In fact, Ken Arrow is important over here because Adam Smith's invisible hand that I just mentioned, that idea of the invisible hand got formalized into a theorem by Ken Arrow and Gerard Debreu. The fundamental theorem of welfare economics lays down conditions given which, in those settings with these conditions, individual selfishness will indeed lead to optimality. But Ken Arrow, being a deep thinker, but he was not a policy person, seldom commented on that. In this paper, Cautious Case for Socialism, he says that those technical assumptions that economists write down, which is his writing down, those axioms that lead to the invisible hand leading to optimality, would break down, that world would break down in no time if we didn't have trust, if we didn't have social norms, if we didn't have respect for one another. Many of these things are there in the last chapter of Joe's Free Fall. It's a reminder from the person who created the theorem that we write down certain axioms explicitly, but there's a whole embedding of assumptions of human values which makes modern society go the way it goes, and we are going in a wrong way. Don't have time enough. I just want to talk of inequality. To me, the level of inequality today is completely unacceptable. And especially as technology progresses and a lot of demand for traditional labor vanishes, we will have to think of novel forms of intervention to take care of this problem of inequality. There are some people, as soon as you say that you need universal basic income or profit sharing, there are some people who will say that isn't it demeaning to give people money when they are not working? So workers should be made to work and then be given money. If they don't work, you can't give them. I remind them, if you think of feudal societies, the feudal lords would be doing no work. The serfs would be doing all the work. We didn't feel sad for the feudal lords, that poor chaps, they are sitting around with no work but getting all the income. We are heading into a world where we'll have to think of novel forms of redistribution because the level of inequality today in the world is just shockingly high, and we will have to think of transfers. And I feel some forms of universal basic income and profit sharing is very, very important. One reason why inequality is becoming important and has an interface with democracy, these are all terrains that we don't fully understand, but we want to get engaged in more and more because of the world we are living in. In the olden days, a big inequality means the richest person will have more yachts, more airplanes maybe later on, more homes. That's the kind of inequality. But now, inequality means you will own a platform. You will own various domains which are domains of influence. So inequality, economic inequality is having a spillover into the democratic functioning of society, and what was referred to already, that the democracy of voice is being trampled over in a big way. We have anthropological accounts from rural India. Anthropologists have written that there's a village council going on. Poor people are talking about their problems, what should be done. And when the village landlord walks in, there's a silence that comes about. The voice is robbed by the presence of this person. And at one level, that's what's happening in the world. So we are getting a massive spillover of the economic inequality into a damage to democracy that is happening around the world. Since I worked for 3 years as a policy advisor to the Indian Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister, I should quickly add. I should tell you that we would spend a lot of time on inequality and inequality management. Inequality in India was very, very high. But we would always have to be conscious. We still could have done much more. We didn't do enough. But we were conscious of the fact that a lot of the inequality management also has a global dimension. You can't do beyond a point with the rest of the world trying to pull out the capital, pull out people. So this is where multilateral organizations, the United Nations, various international organizations that rule around countries today has a very, very special role. So I just wanted to put these topics on the table that we need to get back into. And thank you very much for a forum where one can discuss these ideas. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Kaushik. Our last presenter today is Goldin from Oxford.
Very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to be reinvigorated by having like-minded people together. I've always been inspired by Joe. I was as a student. I'm now a professor at Oxford, and I'm delighted that we've become dear friends. But when I first met him, I was in the South African government, chief executive of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, involved in economic policy. And we felt under pressure to be rather orthodox. We did huge advances, but I remember our first meetings were rather argumentative. I then had the pleasure of hosting him when I became vice president and head of policy at the World Bank in the debate with Ken Rogoff that you referred to, Joe. So that was the second time I think I met you. And since then, it's been uphill, progression of wonderful friendship all the way. So what did the neoliberals get wrong, and what do progressives get wrong, and what do we need to address? I think what the neoliberals, and of course the term is a very slippery one, so people will interpret it in very different ways, but what they got wrong, essentially, those that were fervent about it, was that it was short-term by nature. It would inevitably lead to populism, nationalism, and corporatism. And so what we have today is the end of that era of neoliberalism, a corporatist one, at least in the US, that was generated. I think what they also got wrong, not only that it would sow the seeds of its own destruction, but of planetary destruction. The externalities in climate, in pandemics, in other areas are so intrinsic to the nature of hyper-interconnectivity and transfers, what I call the butterfly defect of globalization, that it was inevitable that it would lead to more systemic risk of various types and more planetary risk. We know, and we've always known as students of economics, about externalities, but more and more people doing well with a withering state means more negative impact of that, and climate is perhaps the best example, but certainly not the only one. Pandemics and many other things are. I think what they also got wrong was that the rent-seeking intrinsic in it leads to a concentration effect in firms, in places, and in incomes. And that concentration effect exacerbates the lack of representation and trust, as do the systemic risks, the butterfly defect. I don't believe we would have had Trump 1.0 in the White House without the financial crisis, or Brexit in Britain for that matter. These things have real destabilizing effects on the ability of people to believe in the state. The withering of the state from the Thatcher-Reagan-Kohl era leads to a complete collapse of the ability of the state to generate revenue and to redistribute. The 30 glorious years of capitalism, the golden age of capitalism, which followed the Second World War, we forget was associated with extremely high tax rates. In the US, around 80%, 78% marginal tax rates. They're actually lower in Europe. And it was really only in the 70s where we had this halving of tax rates, and they've been going down in the race to the bottom ever since. But the race to the bottom is both national and global. And so even countries like Ireland, for example, that say, okay, we'll have low taxes, but we redistribute, and they do that quite effectively. So after distribution, income distribution in Ireland is not bad, is always a zero-sum game. because not everyone can succeed in that, and it's been at the cost, for example, of Europe, that an island is doing, or as well as of the world. So it's a short-term project that had to end, and that means that we are now in a new phase, a phase where the rent-seeking is so naked. You need at least $10 million to become a congressperson, a couple of $1 billion to be president, so that when we get to what the progressives got wrong, is that they didn't see that that was pretty fundamental. So they too were completely captured. Progressive leaders who wanted to be progressive in the US and elsewhere is less of a problem than in the US, found that suddenly it was the banks that were getting them into power, and that they owed big favors to, and others. And so this revolving door between Wall Street and the White House was not at all changed. In fact, it was exacerbated by the progressives, so-called progressives in the White House. They got that fundamentally wrong. They got what they also got fundamentally wrong is that the withering of the state could only be reversed by higher taxes. And no one was prepared to do that because they thought it was political. There was a myopia. No one referred to the golden age of capitalism as being the heyday of the US and of European powers. It was not something that the progressives wanted to bring back, this memory of the past. I think what the progressives also got wrong was that the concentration effect on firms, places, and people meant that you need radical redistribution. You need competition policy that does not allow concentration in firms. You need place-based policies, and it'd be interesting to have this discussion with Glenn because I'm skeptical about most of them. But place-based policies that allow people to move. People in the US today are half as mobile as they were 50 years ago. People cannot move to where the new jobs are. And the transformation from an industrial revolution-based place-based economy to a knowledge-based economy means that this concentration is exacerbated. In other words, people need to move now more rapidly, more quickly, and reskill more dramatically. I think that part of this transformation to the knowledge economy, progressives have also got wrong, and here, Kaushik, I'd love to have a discussion with you, UBI. I love basic income as a concept. I think everyone in our societies deserves a basic income, a decent life, and basic services. I hate the universal part of it. I don't think rich people should be given money. I don't think that that everyone has the right to get funding from the state. And so if we drop the U, I'm happy, but not if we don't. And of course, it's totally unaffordable. It's nonsense to give rich people. It's unethical. And I do think people do get network skills, self-worth, and so on from jobs. Angus Deaton has written rather well about the disease of despair for places that simply live on welfare. So I think that is important. The levelling up agenda, which we talk about in Europe and Britain, to make all places happy, is one that we need to interrogate. And obviously it's related to the industrial policy agenda, but I think it does lead to levelling down if it's not done carefully. In other words, the knowledge economy will push productivity levels to be double or triple in certain places to what they are in other places, and I don't think any amount of shotgun spraying of money around the country is going to address that problem. It's a difficult issue, but it's about affordable housing, it's about public transport, it's about allowing people to move to new jobs. It's much easier than taking jobs to people. What progressives got wrong as well is that this is a global agenda. The nationalism and protectionism and populism we're seeing now was partly progressive inspired. People, particularly in the US, focusing very much at cutting aid, cutting international solidarity and support for international institutions. The only institutions that were supported through the neoliberal era of adjustment were, of course, the Bretton Woods institutions. But the UN was undermined, including by progressives. So the Bretton Woods dominating of the system is part of that, I think, progressive failure. And finally, on AI and jobs, I think we need to think very deeply about this, and that raised the question of development banks and development institutions. I was recruited by Jim Wolfenson to go to the bank when we refused in South Africa to accept World Bank money when I left South Africa, and to try and help him reform the bank. But one of the things, just about naughty words, Joe, at the bank, you can't talk about industrial, you can't talk about development banks either. When I suggested that the World Bank become a wholesale bank for many retail distributional development banks around the world, this was regarded as completely crazy. The only development bank in the world that could possibly work was the World Bank, and maybe some of these regional development banks like the Asian and African and others. So that needs to be addressed. What happens if we don't? And it's getting much more difficult. I think Trump is not a temporary phenomena if he doesn't stand again and get elected again. I think what we have here is a new form of capitalism, a new form of global relationships. It greatly strengthens Asia, particularly China, relatively. The agenda that progressive capitalists, people that believe in progressive capitalism have, is even harder than it was before because of this rewriting of the rules. We will inevitably have more systemic risk, more pandemics, more financial crises. Cyber's the big looming one, of course. The capture of the cyber by the state or by corporate interests is an incredible phenomenon, but very, very risky. More autocrats, more Putins, more Netanyahu, more threats to democracy and human rights. So progressive capitalists have a big agenda, a more important agenda than ever, and the ability to combine growth, jobs, and we could talk about growth, but growth, jobs, human rights, and respect and dignity for individuals with international solidarity has to be at the absolute heart of that. Is it possible? Yes, absolutely. It's very interesting. I have friends in Nepal who just have been keeping me informed of what's going on there. They're very hopeful that things are happening there. This was referred to earlier. And I see in this meeting the seeds of hope as well. So I hope, Joe, that IPD leads to great successes, and in 25 years' time, our successors will be here to celebrate what we've achieved, even if we're gone.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Lots of interesting contributions there, obviously. We're going to throw this over to the audience for questions, not speeches, please, questions. So please think of an interesting question to ask. We're running a little over, so I'll try and keep it short. I'll get things going just quickly, and please, very quick responses all the way along. You all gave many suggestions there for where we are. I mean, I think it's very interesting whether you see this as an opportunity or, a sort of terminal crisis, but let's assume we're in an opportunity rather than a terminal crisis, or not much point in us being here. If you were called into the sort of next Bretton Woods conference, and as an economic advisor you only have one priority, what would it be? What's the most important thing, either at the domestic or the international level, that we need to do to reconstruct some form of managed capitalism, progressive capitalism, socialism, whatever you want to call it, social democracy? Maybe start at the other end this time. Ian?
I think the first thing to recognize is just how perilous this moment is. Business as usual, the road is going off the cliff. I mean, we really are at risk of a third world war, climate catastrophe, pandemics, etc. So I think the extent of why this is a threat needs to be highlighted first. The second is that there are all sorts of ways of addressing this, and they have been addressed in the past. I think the best analogy is First and Second World War. The First World War, obviously, people didn't want to repeat it, but it was repeated for all the reasons we know. But in the midst of the Second World War, people created a new world order, the welfare state, Beveridge, Keynes, the UN system, Bretton Woods, Marshall Plan, massive transfers. And the question is why? And the answer is because they saw it was a repeat game, but also not because we were lucky to have Churchill and Roosevelt. Yes, we were lucky, but that's not the reason we didn't have a repeat game. The reason is that people refused to let their sons go off and die, and that there was an uprising, basically, of discontent, of ordinary people, and Churchill was voted out of office by the biggest landslide Labour's ever had 6 weeks after the end of the Second World War, after he'd won the Second World War. And that's because he wouldn't support the welfare state and internationalism. And so I think we need to learn from the Second World War experience and comparisons with the First, reinvigorate ourselves that these things can be done in the midst of bombs literally dropping on people, in that case in Whitehall, and that we can create a new world order. It's happened before, and it can happen again.
Thank you. Kaushik, what's your proposal or suggestion?
Yeah, there are two. One is to do with one aspect of democracy that we don't pay enough attention to, but it has become suddenly more urgent, is each country, if the world was fully democratic, it would be each country having a completely fair electoral system and choosing leaders. But with globalization, very often there are situations where a neighboring country's leader who gets chosen is more important for you than who gets chosen in your country. Mexico, it's possible that much more important than the Mexican leader is who becomes the leader in the United States. This aspect of global democracy, with globalization, when one country can affect another, is global democracy is hugely damaged. For instance, take this example: if in United States you had a system where Washington will vote, DC will vote, the president will be chosen for the whole country. Immediately you'll get favors coming into DC in huge ways because the entire election was being selected here for the whole country. That's the kind of world we are going into as we get globalization and each country selecting. So global governance is extremely important. And one more idea which I touched on is taxation in innovative ways is important, very important today, or profit sharing, which is the following. There are some platforms, I don't even know which one, which becomes so big that for a common person to exist, you have to function through the platform. If that happens, you hit a difficulty that you can't use conventional antitrust law and break up the platform into 100 or 1,000 platforms, because the economies of scale is the advantage of a platform. When that happens, you've got a platform that is virtually the entry into the economy. You have to think of very radical policies, and we've had an historical example of that. Bank of England, many people may not know, was started as a private profit-making entity with 1,200 shareholders. It was gradually realized that for anyone to survive, this is a firm you have to deal with. This cannot be left in private hands as a profit-maximizing entity. So we have to think of very novel ways where you may have to change some of these platforms, take over from the private sector. And I do believe the private sector has a very important role, but some of the biggest ones may have to go the route of Bank of England, where it's taken over into some kind of public control. And some of these firms, even if you can't cut them up, you can have laws about profit sharing, so that even if it's one big firm making mega profits, if there is a dispersed profit shareholding rule, the profit will go into many pockets. So these are the kinds of things that we have to contend with now.
Thank you very much indeed. Turning the internet monopolies into public utilities. Maria, your idea.
I will speak more as participating, so building on what is going on and how can we build on this to push things in the better direction. Let me refer to a story which happened here in New York back in 2019, where an American president, you may guess who, suddenly in front of the General Assembly, two important things. There is no climate change, and the world belongs to those who push for their national interests. The world does not belong for those who push for international cooperation. And I cannot forget the faces I could see from many delegations in the General Assembly. How can we have the leader of the animal coming to the United Nations General Assembly with such a statement? Now, let's see what happens. What will be the next statement in front of the General Assembly, if he comes. But what I want to refer is that in the meantime, I must say that I'm quite pleased that we managed in the United Nations framework to adopt something called the Pact for the Future, which is not perfect, far from this, but is the best attempt, however, to agree on some common reforms of the multilateral governance, starting with financing for development, going to the climate, going to the trade, and going to the digital. And they're important commitments. And this year, you have a sequence of summits which are organized exactly to put this pact into motion. I see here many, including Joe and Jose Antonio and many others were in Syria for the financing for development, and other summits will follow. So my plea would be, we need to find a way to bring together the forces wherever they are. I think we need to overcome the current geopolitical pattern, which is West against the East and North against the South. No, we need to identify where the actors, wherever they are, to push in this direction. And my wish would be to translate this into also renewed academic world and think tank. I think we need to have, building on IPD experience, a kind of real global think tank.
Okay, global think tank, thanks very much. David, you mentioned law and political economy, not to be confused with law and economics movement. What's the big idea there? Is there one big idea if you were advising the...
Well, it's very difficult for me to imagine being in such a room. Yes, such a question. I'm more the kind of guy who writes things down in the hopes that 30 years from now someone will say,
Right.
at least something is always happening. But I'll say this, it's the lack of dramatic, it's a raising the level of imagination. So I guess I agree with colleagues that I've always been puzzled why the right has bigger policy ideas than the left very often. I mean, I've thought this since Brexit. Break up the arrangements of sovereignty. Okay, maybe it was this terrible idea. But it's that they are willing to change and reorganize in a relatively dramatic way something. And we've been unwilling to do that. So my big fear, my big caution would be the forces of restoration are going to be strong. The desire to have Hillary be president again is going to be in the back of so many people's minds on the left. We have to go back to restoring the institutions that have been damaged and broken, and I hope we don't do that. I hope what we've learned is that we also have to think in the kind of large-scale terms that I've heard already my co-panelists right from the beginning mentioning you today. So think big, that's my point.
Glenn, you had various suggestions in your speech, and you obviously have been an economic advisor to the president. If you had to prioritize one thing, what would it be?
I think the one big thing is to focus on the political economy of growth. AI has come up, probably deserve even more discussion. My concerns about AI are not about engineering, and they're not even about economics, they're about politics. Are we going to manage that correctly? As I said in my remarks, the tension between growth and disruption is as much a political economy discussion as economics. The way I see it, to personify it, the late Queen of England's question to my colleagues at the London School of Economics when she said, why did nobody see it coming? She was asking about the financial crisis, of course. I think the answer to the Queen's question is that economists don't get out enough. And so one trick in getting at political economy is my thesis advisor, Marty Feldstein, used to say, walk around, go talk to people.
Right, thank you very much. Jayati?
Yeah, thank you. I think there have been already excellent proposals, and it's true that a period like this, a period of flux and chaos, is actually a period of opportunity. You can do things. And I'm going to follow David Kennedy. I think tinkering won't do it. You really have to think big. This whole idea that we can do a little reform here and a little bit of change there is, frankly, we have to throw that out the window. It doesn't capture people's imaginations now anyway. So I really think we have to first of all think of an entirely new way of structuring our economies to make the economy serve society rather than the society serve economy. We've been doing this all the time. Get more women in the workforce, that will increase GDP by so much. Do blah, blah, health, it's very good for your economic activity. We have to think completely the other way. What do we want for our societies? Basic needs, human rights, minimal, universal basic services. The income thing we'll come back to. Too often universal basic income in our countries is a substitute for universal basic services, which I really do not support. But yes, So think of the basic needs and lives of dignity and human rights. And therefore, an accountable public sector that has to provide these, which also means much more public revenues and so on and so forth. But I think fundamentally we have to remember that the market system, the large corporations, the all-powerful multinationals, etc., all exist at the mercy of states. We keep forgetting that, but Trump is a very good reminder of that. But you just have to watch all the tech bros sucking up to him in those dinners and so on to realize where power actually lies. And I think our big mistake is to say, oh, well, you know, what can the poor state do? There is all this capital and there's all these multinationals and etc. The power lies with the state. We have to put enough pressure on our states to ensure that they actually serve in the public interest and not in the corporate interest.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We'll throw a few questions to the audience. I say, please make them questions, and if they're for a specific member of the panel, please make it clear if you'd like everybody to weigh in. Haven't got much time, so we'll have 2 or 3 questions. The lady in the corner.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. Is that cool?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay.
So just please identify yourself.
My name is Marina Zucker-Marquez. I work at Boston University. Congratulations, a very interesting debate. My question is about labor movement. So we know there was a lot of mentions about the post-World War situation, Popolani, and we know labor organized unions, labor movements were key for progressive, economic, social gains. But we are living in a very different labor environment, and AI and digital economy is going to change even more. So what is the role of labor and unions in this new environment? Are they going to be relevant, and how? Thank you.
Who would like to tackle that one? I think we do one at a time. Anybody like to comment on labor?
Okay, I'm speaking with you as a former labor minister and a rapporteur of European Pillar of Social Rights. We are dealing now with the implication of the digital transformation of labor. And in the European Union, the topics we are working on with the labor organizations all over are basically the following. First of all, impacts about skills and jobs. Because there is a big choice on the way to shape AI. Either AI is there to replace human labor, or AI is there to complement human labor. And this makes a total difference with huge implications on the way to organize work and companies. The second point is about gig work. So platform workers and digital workers, they might be at home also. And now they are millions and millions, billions. We need to reinvent welfare system. We need to make sure they have access to social protection, training rights, they have voice. So we are updating entirely labor law and social law to deal with this. And then there is the third point, which requires a lot of international cooperation, is we would like all the other countries to make this kind of work. Because we know that if we don't have an updated global standard for AI, digital and work, we will have what we call in Europe social dumping in large scale. And then we are going to a downward spiral on the quality of work and remuneration and access to social rights. Okay. And frankly, I agree with my panel colleagues when they are skeptical about the power of the so-called universal minimum income. I think the priority for us remains to have access to good jobs, rewarding jobs, meaningful jobs, even in the AI era.
Thank you very much. Jayati, I saw you writing something down. Did you have a...
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, Marina, I would basically say, just like Maria Joao, we have to expand. I mean, one of the reasons trade unions have lost their attraction even for working people is because they were very restricted. So we have to expand the notion of workers' organizations to not just formal workers and gig workers, but informal workers, unpaid workers, and would-be workers who cannot get jobs. And it's only on that basis that you will get sufficient public support that would actually create the required mobilization.
Okay, thank you very much. Chap here had his hand up.
I'm Giovanni Dosi from Pisa. I fully agree with most of the things that have been said so far. I think one underestimates the fact that neoliberalism is not
You can, sorry, you can.
on like that. Okay. I think neoliberalism is not an economic ideology. It is a vision of the world. It is a sort of toxic dystopia. Modern societies have worked
Sorry, do you have a question?
different balances between
Do you have a question?
the balance between liberté, égalité, fraternité. The dystopia of neoliberalism is to have liberté, and liberté only as economic freedom. In that sense, I think that there is a continuity between the seeding neoliberalism, the third way, the Clinton, the Blair, the Holland, all the way to the current policies, in the sense that there is an acceptance of the fundamental philosophy of neoliberalism. What to do? I think David was suggesting it. Rediscover collective groups, conflicts, the we and them. It's not society does not exist, only individuals. It is we workers have got different interests from private equity. And if we don't rediscover this collective conflictual aspect, I think we'll never move away from neoliberalism.
Thank you. Any questions? Chap at the back.
Thank you. Richard Kozel-Wright, recovering United Nations official. Picking up maybe from David and Jayati on thinking big. There's one place in the world that's been thinking big for the duration of IPD, and it's China. And none of you've really talked about how you think of China in the current world context. So I would be interested for anyone to pick up what's your progressive take on the rise of China as a transformative force in the global economy.
Excellent question. Anybody like to take that one? Ian?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was actually on my list, but I ran out of time. I think is China a progressive capitalist country? And the answer, I think, is no, but it does have many elements in its aspirations that would be that. But is human rights, is dignity, are those fundamental to our concept of progressive capitalism? And those are clearly absent in China. So China's done phenomenally well, will continue to do phenomenally well out of globalization. It was the biggest beneficiary by far of it. And that's why the Communist Party is pretty strongly in power. If the world order of trade really is undermined in a way that disadvantages China, which Trump is doing the opposite of, then I think China would be compromised too. But my own sense is that China is very rapidly going to grow in strength in the future, but it will not be a model in the US or in Europe of progressive capitalism. I think it could be seen that way in many, many developing countries, and its soft power will increase as the US's declines. So I think it is emboldening autocrats and parties not committed to human rights and democracy.
Very much. Anybody else on the panel like to take that one? Jayati.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, I would call it state-driven capitalism, but, I mean, we can argue over the terms, it doesn't really matter. Definitely, it's extraordinarily successful. It shows what you can do when you actually regulate markets and you regulate private capital and discipline private capital. I think that's an essential element of its success. Sure, it was a beneficiary of globalization, but only because it had the domestic institutional structure and all of that. I think basically I would go along with what he had said in the sense that it seems that there is a kind of Faustian pact, if you like, between, you say, okay, I will deliver you growth and rising living standards, and in return you shut up, basically. The social and political rights are not are not on offer. But in return, yes, you will definitely get rising material standards and so on. So this is always a complex negotiation. So it's not just a question what we like and what we want. There are too many examples in history of how over time this doesn't work.
Thank you. David, did you have one?
Just one thing. I think the gap in knowledge about China is huge. So I've been going back and forth to China for a while and did some stuff with Joe there. They know about us down to the bottom. And the number of people in this country who know anything about the inside of Chinese economic policy, or the ways in which at the local as well as at the national level they've handled security questions of medical security, old age security, health, and so on, and the challenges there is very, very small. So I think my first point about China is we really need to understand the variety of internal things that have been tried and what's worked and what hasn't, and how they've related to one another much better than we do before we can come to a judgment about the question of whether they are unbalanced and model for other countries to follow in general.
Thank you. Last question, anybody? One with his hand up.
Thanks so much. It's been really interesting. There's a little bit of an echo, which is driving me crazy. But, so,
Can you just introduce yourself, please?
I'm Jeff Holland with Open Society Foundations. So I guess I'm coming away from this panel and I've heard a little bit about the policies that need to change. And we can solve this thing by going back to some key policies. And I think, Glyn, you spoke to some of them. And then there's a little bit deeper on theory, which I think David and some of the others spoke to, like what is wrong at the center of our neoliberal theory. And then I hear Jayati say, look, our values are mixed up. We have oriented our societies towards economy rather than the other way around. And I wonder, could I try and pick a fight here? I'd be curious to hear where you all think we need to start at this point and where we are.
Okay, Ghosh.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you bring this up, and I think on this I fully agree with what Jayati was saying earlier. This obsession with the economy at the center. And one thing that we don't realize is human preferences. In economics, we take them as given. We are born with preferences and we live to maximize those. But of course, a lot of life is created preference, and one of the biggest things is a spillover of the economy. I noticed during my 7 years in the world of policymaking, GDP is like a sport. You're playing that game and watching how your country is doing in the global GDP ranks, and there's celebration when news goes out that GDP has risen, not pausing for a moment to wonder who is this benefiting. And another fallout, and you can see these are created games. Countries watch how many of their richest people are in the list of the world's top 100 richest people. And you celebrate. You say that, look, there are 18 of my country people who are in the world's 100 richest people. In fact, I feel we have reached a point where if a rich person creates a fund asking ordinary people to put in some money so that that person can rise in the global rank, people will actually do it, because that is the kind of economic nationalism that we have created. So it is broadening this. So it's going back also to what Joe earlier mentioned, the Washington consensus. The kind of view that has been pushed by that, which during my time at the World Bank I could see, it's a tiny view of a very economics-oriented neoliberal kind of view that you're then pushing down the gullets of countries which didn't have those aspirations. And that, again, does a great amount of damage. A footnote to what Joe wrote in one of his papers, Washington consensus is not even a consensus of Washington on the rest of the world. It's a consensus of 18th Street to 24th Street of Washington being pushed down on the rest of the world. And the economic approach has done that. This is a big agenda, which through writing, through talking, we have to try to correct that.
I think your question is exactly the right one. I do think it's a moment for big policy. One is that we care about the mass participation of society. That is a rethinking from the neoliberal perspective. And there is that we are here to organize around that. I mentioned Polanyi. Polanyi wouldn't have accepted a debate over markets versus the state. He said, what's more kind of the middle? I called it inelegantly connective tissue, but communities, that have made the rest of the debate.
Okay, a quick one, yeah.
There's another whole part of the university that doesn't think the economy is at the center of everything. We think law is at the center of everything. And then there are people who think culture and all kinds of other things to do. So, okay, so just to say, I think in this room, there's one other one. I think in this room there's a lot of thinking that economics and the economy is at the center of things, but in my world we think law is at the center, which means the way things are put together, the connective tissue. I mean, I'm actually teaching Polanyi on Monday. So the modes of interaction and their social meaning is as significant as their economic meaning and their political meaning, and they need to be thought of together in the way in which societies are put together. I don't think we've thought about it enough that way. We focus too much on money and who has it and who should have it, and not enough on how the society is organized in a way that's meaningful.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got one last question.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment in the Conference on Financing for Development. It was interesting because the document was consensus because the U.S. walked away. Okay? No, is it possible to have a multilateralism without the U.S.? So is that the way we're going in the world?
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody like to come and answer that one? Or are we?
We could see this, how to play with this in CB, in fact, Financing for Development Summit. Well, I would say this is very worrying. When we have the hegemonic country just not coming to a key forum of decision about the world. In tactical terms, I think my answer to your question, yes, we need to move forward even without the United States. But we know this is not a real comprehensive answer to the challenges of the world. So we know this very well. And I would like just to kind of final provocation for upcoming debates is the following. Well, I very much agree with my colleagues when they said the starting point, well, like the Jayati, how should we start? It's from people's needs. And for Polanyi approach, absolutely. But the issue I'd like to draw your attention, exactly because we don't have the American representative coming to the United Nations, I really think that we are in a new era. Because here we are debating how to overcome the neoliberal paradigm as a dominant doctrine. But we have another one, immersion, which has other roots. If I just refer someone born in Europe, educated in South Africa, and now very much prominent here in the United States, I'm referring to Peter Thiel. If you read Peter Thiel's writings, you understand this is not just the neoliberal mantra. This is something much more disturbing. This is really against democracy as a whole. Is arguing that democracy is no longer the way for humankind to govern themselves. This is counterproductive. And these kind of ideas are becoming extremely influential. And I can tell you that we see this operating in many European countries. So we are worried with this. And so that's why I'm saying we really need to have a progressive agenda which is not at all going to the past, at all. We really need to come up with a convincing alternative, having in mind that it's not only about the neoliberal influence. Is a new doctrine emerging with deeper consequences.
Okay, thank you. Ian, did you have?
Yeah, just on the question of multilateralism, I think part of a progressive capitalist agenda or progressive agenda has to be a deep rethinking of multilateralism and the assumptions that government have to be at the center of everything in that. Of course, it's a tragedy that the US has stepped out, but it has to redouble the efforts of everyone else to recommit to all the things that have to be done. And in the US, I think it really puts pressure on other actors, cities, states, civil society groups, business associations, etc. And one of the terrifying things that I think Trump has done is to get business to reverse all its commitments on climate and DEI, for example.